We are going to be 10 billion by 2050. We are going to live on a planet 4 degrees hotter. We are going to have more mouths and less food. We are going to have less land and more pollution. But we crossed oceans and we defeated diseases. But we went to the moon and we blossomed the desert. Because we are innovators. We are farmers. We are makers. We are dreamers. And we are going to gather and discuss, create and inspire minds and souls. Because we are feeding our future.
Good afternoon, everybody. Roughly 1.3 million tons of food produced in the world every year gets lost and wasted. To put this into perspective, just 1/4 of this could feed the 795 million people around the world who suffer from hunger. This is the world we live in today, and it is undeniable that there is a major global food crisis. It is our job to resolve these gaps between the production, distribution, and consumption of food, eliminating possibilities of food waste and creating produce that is beneficial for the environment, public health, human communities, and animal welfare. And this is what the food revolution is built on. It is the concept that together we can create innovative and, most importantly, sustainable methods of food production, combating growing population, climate change, and scarcity, and by doing so, revolutionize the world of food for the future generations. I believe that this decade is a transitional period between traditional agriculture and groundbreaking methods of sustainable and universal food production. Thank you.
Imagine a world in which mothers are worried about the content of their family's food, where eaters are constantly fear about chemicals in their food, where cookbooks and magazines are filled with recipes, pictures, and lifestyle advice. Cult food celebrities start cooking classes, restaurants are sprouting up everywhere. Foods are advertised as pure and natural, and technology brings us better food. This sounds like the food revolution of today, but it's not. This is a scene from the mid-19th century Europe and North America. Surprised? I wasn't. As a historian of science, whenever someone pronounces something as revolutionary or unprecedented, I usually end up being the cranky grandma said, well, I remember, and way back when, and bursting everyone's happy bubble. But I do realize it's an occupational hazard of being a historian. But given our society's obsession with food, it's a question well worth asking. According to Michael Pollan in an article in the New York Review of Books, quote, food in America has been more or less invisible, politically speaking, until very recently, at least until the early 1970s. Americans have not had to think very hard about where their food comes from or what it is doing to the planet, their bodies, and society. As much as I respect Michael Pollan, which is quite a bit, I would have to vehemently disagree with this premise. As the philosopher Jean-Riyad Savarin said in his influential treatise, The Physiology du Goût, or The Physiology of Taste, the fate of nations depends on how they are fed. For Riyad Savarin, the food wasn't for consumption. It was both constitutive and constituent of social norms and political stability. In some ways, we could call Riyad Savarin a precursor to the cult of food movement literature such as Francis Moore Lappé, Wendell Berry, or even Eric Schlosser. I'm sure many of you are asking, well, why does this even matter? Who cares if this is an old idea? Why can't we be happy that people are paying attention to such matters now? It matters because if we are to solve the current challenges of the food system, from environmental degradation to animal welfare to nutritional challenges to political instability, we must critically examine how and why food revolutions happen. So let's take a look at what could be defined as the food revolution's past. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the phrase, let them eat cake. And although it's attributed to Marie Antoinette, it actually is a phrase that has been made up according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but that's a side point. The contempt however, is quite real. As bread was the staple of the peasantry and working classes of France, the bread shortages were something to have a revolution over, as was the case in 1789. While the phrase may be a piece of fiction, the phrase encapsulates what food revolutions are and instill in many places in the third world and developing countries a scarcity of foodstuffs, often blamed upon the ruling class, whether it was the monarchy or the government. Just in 100 years, France had food crises from 1649 to 1651, 1661, 1693, 1709 and 1710, and almost all of the 1770s, and of course 1789. The rest of Europe, including the UK, was also subject to poor grain harvests and famines during the 1770s. Within colonial America, riots and protests against tea and sugar taxes fed resentment of the British ruling masters. As the rest of the continental ruling establishment looked in horror at the potential social unrest unleashed by food insecurity, they tried to establish price controls, stockpile wheat, and even tried giving prizes for new technologies. None of this made a huge difference in food security in Europe. What did make a difference was the scientific and technological advances of the late 18th and early 19th centuries and the beginnings of a global trade system called mercantilism. For most of the early modern period, from the 15th through the 19th century, national wealth wasn't defined by GAP. It was defined by stockpiles of gold. The concept of mercantilism conflated political power with economic trump, basically a economic nationalism that was fairly similar to the populist economic policies of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, or UKIP, with the goal of autarky, a complete independence from foreign trade. Through colonialism, European nations grabbed new sources of raw materials and new markets. It became a vicious cycle in which countries would go to war and conquer new territories in an insatiable quest for more wealth. Thus, European colonies in the Americas, South Asia, and the Caribbean culminating in the Napoleonic Wars. Territorial control and colonialism demanded stable foodstuffs that could carry explorers across vast territories. Food had to withstand the elements, not just for days, try months. In many ways, those who had the most advanced food production and distribution systems won the trade game. Preserved food would not only provision armies and fleets, but also became goods to enrich the nation. The Portuguese ingeniously perfected the method of creating salcod, thus feeding explorers across the Atlantic into the New World. The invention of sugarcane processing rollers allowed sugar to be processed from the Caribbean and Latin America in quick time, enriching the Spanish and the Portuguese. Venice and Genoa's control of the spice trade allowed them to be one of the wealthiest cities in the 15th century. By 1760, the British Navy had to feed 16,000 men and had their own provisioning supplies with breweries, mills, and meatpacking plants at the port. And by the 19th century, steam engines allowed British to brew porter and bake biscuits. And even Napoleon, to avoid the British blockade of sugar, offered a reward for anyone being able to create its domestic source of sugar. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1850, a thriving global trade in foodstuffs in place. Tea, coffee, and sugar was commonplace in major European cities. Baking came from Denmark, wines from France. Through importing rye and wheat from Poland and the Ukraine, paid for in herring, Amsterdam became the biggest wheat market in the world. Between the advances in agricultural output, industrial food processing, and new foodstuffs, Europeans were not starved for choice. Urbanization prompted governments to create new roads and infrastructure and to carry food from the countryside to rapidly growing cities. By 1850, half of Britain's population lived in cities. Paris had grown to 1.1 million by 1856. The Americas and India and certainly slavery supplied vast amounts of raw material to feed growing factories and the populations working within them. It is precisely at this period we see a major change in what we deem as food revolutions. Previously, food revolutions were based upon food security and economics, the price and availability of foodstuffs. By the mid-19th century, beef and other proteins, fats, and sugars were not just available to the elite, but to a growing salaried middle class and an exploding working class. But with the new consumer classes with their new purchasing power, food itself became an issue of quality, not an issue of quantity. Granted, food security was still an issue for the rural poor, but advances in both agricultural production and food processing made rights far less likely. What was the 19th century version of lifestyle magazines, newspapers, magazines, and books were dedicated to the science of domesticity, filled with recipes, entertaining tips, and nutritional advice. The best foods for children, how to cook within a tight budget, how to choose ingredients. Advances in chemistry justified nutritional choices such as proteins found in wheat and beef. Access to information regarding food and medicine was not limited to the role of personal physicians of the court and the bourgeoisie anymore. They were now available to all via the press. Cookbooks like Mrs. Beeton's Cookery Book became the primer for English-speaking countries from India to Canada. Henrietta David's Practitioner's Cooking Book went through 20 revised editions during her lifetime and another 42 by 1906 and was translated into Danish, Dutch, and English. But the key here was the availability and choice of food. Instead of having food choices dictated by supply, households were now free to choose the number of different products and suppliers. Whether previous generations had foodstuffs from the garden, store, or daily market, housewives went to butchers to give them precise cuts of meat, mutton, and pork, and bakeries where you could buy cakes, breads, and pies. At the Chicago World's Fair, 1893, a variety of new foodstuffs introduced, including juicy fruit gum, Jemima pancake mix, and the hipsters, of course, ever favorite beer, Pabst Blue Britain. But with all this choice, there was also a dilemma. Although food industrialization brought more food to more people, there was an increasing separation of between the sources of food production and those who consumed them. Food safety was a constant threat. Milk was rumored to have liquefied sheep's brains. Potato starch was found in chocolate. Coffee was supposedly had horse's liver. Medical and chemistry journals, such as The Lancet, analyzed foodstuffs for purity. Cadbury advertised its chocolate as absolutely pure, therefore the best. The public outcry was immediate, and it led to the passage of laws such as the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Drug Act in the United States, as well as new food safety laws within Britain and across the continent. Within the agricultural sector, farmers are also concerned about the health and future of agriculture. In 1924, a group of German farmers approached a man named Rudolf Steiner, who developed a system of farming without the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides called biodynamics. The Kellogg brothers of cornflake fame ran the newly founded Battle Creek Sanatorium, which described a holistic approach to health with an emphasis on vegetarianism and temperance versus that of the vices of the modern world. So what can we learn from this? There are a few constants that we can count on that we can learn from the 19th century. One, that basically the free flow of goods as well as the free flow of information makes a much more educated consumer society that has choices versus that of knowledge is passed down to them. Two, revolutions about food happen when social norms or constants are broken. Three, as food is global, the consequences are definitely local. Much like the 19th century, the problems in our food system are a product of the inherent tension between an industrialized food system, quality, and taste. Technological advancements in agriculture and food processing, as well as industrialization of food, has brought more food to more people, but in an increasing separation between consumers and the means of food production questions not only how our food is produced, but what consequences it has for our health, society, and environment. For the late 19th and early 20th century, the answer lied in a growing civil society that demanded that governments be accountable for food quality. Increasing scientific research into food practices, organic chemistry, and medicine armed the press with new knowledge about nutrition. What is fundamental about food revolutions both in the 18th and 19th century and now is that food has become a moral imperative. It goes back to the old Aristotelian question of what is the good life. How we answer this question will determine not only what our food revolutions are to come, but what and how big they will be in the future. Thank you.
One more time, let's do it again. When Pablo Picasso was asked about new technology, he said, "Computers are useless. They can only give you answers." I assume we all disagree strongly on the first part, but on the latter, he for sure had a valid point. Because true progress comes from asking the right questions. And here you are spot on. Because the question is not whether we need a food revolution. The question is how big will that revolution have to be? Change is inevitable. If we include those getting too little, too much, or the wrong types of food, as much as half the world's population is currently malnourished. Globally, poor diets are now posing a greater risk to human health than tobacco, alcohol, and drugs combined. That is shocking. And on the other hand, on the environmental side, food production is the single most important factor of climate change, deforestation, and environmental damage. On top of that, as much as one-third of everything we produce is either lost or wasted. So, with business as usual, there is no chance at all that we will be able to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, as currently food production is responsible for as much as 30% of the annual emissions. And neither will we be able to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, as food is linked either directly or indirectly to almost all 17 of those goals. On the other hand, which is the good hand, if we are getting it right on food, it could be our greatest opportunity to both improve the health of people and planet. Because there are so many synergies between food, health, and the environment. So if we are able to unlock these synergies, we can create a global food system that really delivers on the whole SDG agenda. So, how big will the food revolution have to be to meet the needs of a 2030 world? Right now, no one really knows. No one has the exact answer. But what we do know is that it will require radical changes across the supply chain, from farm to fork, and even down to the waste bin. And it will obviously require major commitments from all sectors, from science, business, politics, civil society, and we of course also need us as consumers to get on board. The good news is, change is already happening. So great initiatives are popping up literally everywhere. New research projects, government commitments, business solutions, and even consumer trends are, with maybe a few exceptions, looking to the US, for example, mostly are these trends going in the right direction. So the question is, how? Well, it's still bits and pieces. That's the problem. And it's not happening fast enough. So the question is, how do we turn all these scattered game changers into one efficient, comprehensive movement? Although we obviously have a long way to go on tackling climate change, there are already some important lessons to be learned. At least for climate, we have a plan. There we have an intergovernmental panel, an IPCC, to gather all the science, which is the basis for our common science-based target of 2 degrees or less than 2 degrees. And we also have a platform, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its COP meetings, where we are allowed to drive commitments and track progress. We need a similar setup and similar targets for the food system. I guess I'm both impatient and a little bit naive, Norwegian. But I was tired of waiting, and in order to do something while waiting, I started something called EAT 4 years ago, together with Professor Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is a part of the University of Stockholm. It started out with a 2-day conference in Sweden, in Stockholm, gathering 500 leaders from science, business, politics, and civil society from more than 28 countries. And the annual Eat Stockholm Food Forum is still our main arena for stakeholders and partners to take part, take action, and of course take lead. And the Eat Forum is also the breeding ground for new ideas, partnerships, and programs. So together with our partners, we are now building collaborative platforms to catalyze and speed up the food system revolution. So to identify the targets, we have initiated a mini IPCC in collaboration with one of the world's leading medical journals, The Lancet. We have now set up a commission, an Eat Lancet Commission, of 20 top scientists, which will provide the first comprehensive assessment of what constitutes healthy diet from sustainable food systems. Sorry, can I have some water on there, Diane? Sorry. So this will be the initial. Obviously, much more work is needed, but this is the first attempt. Oh, that was good. This is an initial attempt to find the 2-degree equivalent for food. So all other EAT programs are building on this work and aiming to create the measures to take us there, all the way from international policies to concrete recipes. So together with the London-based think tank, the Chatham House, we are now working on a new commission which will provide recommendations for policymakers. And in partnership with the C40 network and building on the leadership shown in this city with the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, we are now helping the world's biggest cities from New York, Addis Ababa to Wuhan and of course Milan, to share best practices on how to implement strategies that work. Together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we are working with the food industry to create the business solutions through something we call FRESH. And in collaboration with top chefs and culinary institutions, we are now setting up a network for culinary professionals to turn the science into edible solutions. But between big food and chefs, there is a multitude of entrepreneurs and bold investors and innovators. Undoubtedly, technology is key to translate the SDGs into something tasty on a plate. And of course, to make it accessible, affordable, and not to forget, aspirational for everybody, everywhere. Therefore, we in EAT, we are thrilled to join forces with Seeds and Chips, because in our minds, you represent some key features that we need in the future. First of all, technology, optimism, and not to forget, an inclusive and collaborative spirit. So just like an Italian family dinner, you are literally inviting everybody to the table, which we love. Because today's biggest obstacles to speed up the food system revolution, that's not the lack of facts, the lack of policy options, or the lack of innovation. No, it's for sure lack of collaboration and lack of strategic alignment. So these days, a lot of people have great expectations to the Internet of Things and how that will allow us to connect all the devices and make our lives smarter and more efficient. And I'm among the believers. But what if we could mirror this to create an Internet of collaboration, to allow us to connect, share ideas, co-create, and scale up our efforts? So really a worldwide web of initiatives where everyone are playing different roles, but we are all working together towards a joint vision, which is the future we want. So back to the question where I started out, how big is the food revolution? Well, it goes beyond innovation in products and production methods, and it will require a brand new approach to the way we collaborate to find the answers and scale the solutions that work. It will for sure be among one of the biggest and most important collaborations in our lifetime. When we succeed, we will improve lives of billions for present and future generations to come. And we will safeguard the health of the planet, which we all depend upon. So, of course, failure is not an option. But it's impossible not being optimistic by being here in Milan today and see all the seeds of change around at this conference. So I look forward to further collaboration and to find the right answers to take us there. Thank you very much.
Hi, how's everyone doing today? So the question we were asked to talk about is how big is the food revolution? But I think in order for us to talk about how big it is, we need to define what it is. So for a lot of you people here at Seeds and Chips, you might think the food revolution started about 5 years ago when all the investment money and all the food startups started to happen. But it actually started a long time ago. And Evelyn brought up actually started in the 19th century, but I'm going to talk about the 1950s and the 1960s. So after World War II, women started going to work. They were out of the house more, and foods that companies were producing tended to be more convenient. So some of the foods that came out in those 2 decades, I can't believe it's not butter. This is margarine. Personally, I can believe it's not butter because these are some of the ingredients in it. Another product that came out, Tang. I don't know if Tang was ever sold in countries other than the US, but it's a orange powdered, orange-like juice drink. And when I was young, you were cool if you drank this because the astronauts drank it when they were in space. But Tang, these are some of the ingredients in Tang. Now, if you notice, the first ingredient is sugar. Now, one of the things, if you haven't heard yet, that came out recently is that the sugar industry covered up research that showed that sugar is what contributes to heart disease, not saturated fat, like we've been told for so many years. And the other thing I find interesting, yellow 5 and yellow 6 is an artificial color, but there's artificial color N5 and 6, so what is that artificial color? Now, the scariest thing to me is BHA. It's another ingredient in Tang. It stands for, wait, I want to find it. It stands for butylated hydroxynanosol. So I can't pronounce it, but I can't believe that that is good for you. The United States Food and Drug Administration says that it's generally recognized as safe, but the National Institute of Health considers BHA a reasonably anticipated human carcinogen, which doesn't sound very good. So, next, Cool Whip. Don't know if Cool Whip made it outside the States, but it's fake whipped cream. It includes trans fats and these other lovely ingredients. So a couple other products that were being sold to consumers. Pam. Pam is cooking oil in a can. It's canola oil, but it also has propellant and dimethyl polysiloxane added to it. Also, Pop-Tarts, Diet Pepsi, Pringles, the potato-like chip, came out then, as well as Sweet and Low, and my favorite, Swanson frozen TV dinners. Now, in the 60s, I was actually fed this as a child. We didn't have it often. My parents actually had a garden. We did eat pretty well. But this, every now and then, was a treat that we were given. That thing up top in the middle is dessert. And the difference between what you're looking at and what people actually ate is they actually came in aluminum or aluminium trays. So the food actually tasted like tin, if you tasted anything. And honestly, it tasted just as good as it looks. So I can't say this might have been convenient, but I can't say it really tasted that well. So I think you get the point. People started being sold foods that had ingredients like this. Now, the unfortunate thing is that even today, these products are still sold, and people are still eating these ingredients. So from my perspective as a food advocate, I'm not surprised that people don't trust big food. And I know big food is changing, but this just explains why activists and advocates have taken some issue with them. So let's go to 1971. In 1971, Alice Waters opened her restaurant in Northern California, Chez Panisse. She sourced all her ingredients locally. She used whole foods. She was one of the first, if not the first, local sustainable farm-to-table restaurants. In 1977, Anne Marie Colbin founded the Natural Gourmet Institute. The Natural Gourmet Institute is the United States' oldest health-focused cooking school. And they are still around today with the same goal, which is to provide healthy food and to bring it back to our dinner tables. Now, also in the 1970s, agriculture policy in the United States changed. And I do apologize, this is a US-specific talk, but I think you can extrapolate, and this happened in a lot of other countries. My expertise just happens to be in the US. But in the 1970s, subsidies, very large subsidies, were given to wheat, corn, and soy. Now, what that meant is that prices for those commodity crops went down, yields went up, and companies started to add them more and more to their foods. So, essentially, nutrition was discarded and replaced with company profit. So now we're at the early 1990s. There's a huge divide. We've got big food selling overprocessed, nutrient-lacking food, selling meat from factory farms where animals were raised in inhumane conditions. But we also have the US government is starting to develop the national organic standards. So the movement toward fresh, healthier food has started. Fast forward to the 2000s, that's when the obesity epidemic got a lot of attention. According to the Harvard School of Public Health, in 1990, obese adults made up less than 15% of the US population. By 2010, 25% or more of residents in 36 US states were obese, and the UK and Australia were right in line with us. So here we've got the early 2000s. We've got factory farming, industrial food production, overprocessed food, nutrient-lacking food, and obesity epidemic. So this is when activists really started to organize nationally. This is when they started to push local, sustainable, and organic food into supermarkets, when they started to educate consumers and explain to them what was going on with the food system and what they could do about it. So these activists have been around for at least 30 plus years. And there's something that, like earlier they had a whole session on millennials and how millennials are changing the food system. One thing that I think is often overlooked, why do millennials care about food so much? They did not pop out of their mother's womb saying, I care about food. They care about food because these activists for 30 plus years have put into the zeitgeist and out into the general atmosphere that we need to look at the issues around food and we need to do something about it. So the activists from 30 years ago are why millennials now care about food. So today, these activists, they're worried because so much work still needs to be done, and the new food revolution hasn't been doing much to help. So consider this. How can we have a food revolution if we have no farmers? We hear about food tech, we hear about all this fancy stuff being done in containers, but what about farmers out in not just rural America, in developing countries where there is no tech? They're having a bigger issue than you realize. Now, farmers in the US, I don't know if this is a global statistic, but farmers in the US are in their late 50s. That data is a little old. They might be in their early 60s at this point. They are not encouraging their children to become farmers. So what are we going to do if we have no farmers? How are we going to have our meal delivery services? How are we going to have all our products with healthy ingredients if we don't have farmers? Vertical farming and urban agriculture is definitely part of the solution, but it is not the whole solution. We have to start looking at the rural-urban divide and the fact that this new movement is not really thinking about people who are outside the bubbles. So this is a bit of my pet peeve, so I'm trying to be calm about this. But my question to people at this conference is, how come we aren't investing money in converting farmland to organic? Why is so much money going into flashy, fancy food tech ideas? I mean, I know of a food company that was essentially a glorified CSA, an online CSA, which is community-supported agriculture. They went out of business. They lost $26 million. Do you know what a group of farmers could do with $26 million? My biggest pet peeve is 3D ravioli, and I apologize because I know there are 3D food printed people here today, but how about we stop investing so much in 3D printed food and start investing in farmers around the world? My other issue, meal kits. Okay, I love Blue Apron, but how many more home delivery service cooking meal kits do we need? Every time I go online, there's a new one that started. I mean, I think it's oversaturated. So we already have the answers to our food problems. We just need to listen to the people who are already creating real change in their communities. They're creating real change from the ground up. It might not be as sexy as these fancy high-tech stuff, but there is change going on, successful, viable change. And these people are not getting the attention and the investment that they should be getting. So let's go back to our question. How big is the food revolution? Well, after all this buildup, all I can say is, I don't know. Nobody knows. I can tell you this, it's much bigger than any of us realize. I've been a food advocate for almost 20 years now, and over the past couple years, I've started mentoring startups. So I have a bit of a feel for both spaces, and what I have realized is that the food tech and food startup movement is not talking to the nonprofit food advocacy movement, and we need to. Think of how much better and how much bigger this food revolution would be if we collaborated and worked together. We need to connect and to collaborate and to work together, because food problems are not just food problems. Food problems are family problems, educational problems, environmental problems, financial problems, and so much more. So, the 21st century, business is collaborative. There's a huge shift that's going on and has been going on. Greed and competition is so 20th century. And I've heard it several times throughout today, with millennials and the younger generation, there is a shift toward collaborative business. We need to work together. Though you think I might have been slagging off big food, I'm not. I'm pointing out what's happened. And what I'm suggesting is that we work together to find common solutions. Yes, we want to make a profit. Yes, we want the businesses to be successful, but not at the expense of other people, and not through greed. Change Food is determined to make healthy, safe, delicious food available to everyone, everywhere on the planet. In the not too distant future, there will not be a food revolution. There will not be a food movement. We won't have to distinguish local, healthy, organic, sustainable, because all that healthy, local, delicious food will just be called food. And I hope you will join us. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. When you hear about the future of food on TV or in the press, you often hear about the most sensational innovations: 3D printer, food printer for pizza, algae, insects, and so on. Even my friends and family, when I mention that my job is to study the future of food, always ask me, but is it true that we'll have to eat insects? But when I ask them back, I don't know, what do you think? Would you? Their answer is quite different and interesting. As an independent expert on these topics, I noticed that there are a lot of changes right now, a lot of interest for the food sector from investors and VC, a lot of new products and services, as we can see here, and promising research programs in several fields. But I also believe that we need to take a step back from this media noise, a step back from these sometimes too optimistic predictions. I believe we need a proper analysis on these trends. That's why, last fall, I conducted a study of around 50 experts and professionals of the entire food chain, experts and professionals of the agri-food sector, retail sector, and food service. In this survey, they had to grade each trend on a scale from 1, so the trend will remain marginal, to 10, the trend will become mainstream in 2030. These experts and professionals are people in charge of research and development, marketing, innovation, strategy in big companies as Nestlé, Bonduelle, Bell, Savencia, Auchan, Carrefour, and so on. They are French people, but with the company, international companies. So they are the people that are working on the future of food right now, often with startups. Beside of the ranking, they could comment their rating, and their comments were very useful for the analysis part. So I will briefly present you the outcomes of the survey. I will begin with the first step of the food chain, with agriculture and with the trend of vertical farming. We can see now a lot of commercial urban farms around the world, from the Lufa farms to our Areo farm in New York, and to the project Sasakis in Shanghai, and so on. Several of these farms already work with supermarkets to sell their production. But I have to say that I'm sorry for the people working on that subject, but the people I surveyed are quite divided about this trend. This mark represents a mean between people who rated very low and people who rated quite high. They are divided because they recognize that vertical farming can meet the demand for fresh and local products, for the moment mainly fruits and vegetables, but they don't think this is the solution for feeding the world. They mention, for example, the shortcomings when it comes to efficiency and especially cost of investment and cost of products. In the retail sector, e-commerce is only just starting. Online food sales still represent between 1% and 5% of the market across countries. But with new actors like Amazon and Google, and with millennials, the digital natives, very fond of this time gain, we can bet that it will grow quickly in the near future. That's what the respondents believe, and they gave it a high score, as you can see. The same is true about food delivery from restaurants. But here the respondents think that it is above all a urban trend because it needs a high density of population to be profitable. In the retail sector again, short supply chains like community-supported agriculture attract a larger share of consumers in a lot of developed countries. They could maybe become a threat to traditional retailers since they are becoming more convenient and they are boosted by online platforms. But some of the people surveyed still believe that they will remain limited to a certain category of consumers, the more activist-minded and the upper class. They are more confident in locally sourced products in supermarkets, which is already on the road, so they gave it a higher mark. The organic food trend, which is growing in a lot of countries, even in the developing ones, is here to stay, according to most of the respondents. But some of them point out that organic products will stay too expensive to become really mainstream. Some also fear that organic production may be a little idealized and may suffer very deeply from a potential health scandal or fraud. Speaking now of changing diets, we hear a lot about vegetarian, vegan, and flexitarian diets. As these diets concern a growing share of the population, especially among young people, respondents gave it a high rate. But they see flexitarianism more likely to spread than veganism in France in any case. So, in order to respond to this demand, I asked them to rate several alternatives, beginning with algae, microalgae like spirulina, chlorella, and so on, because they are very rich in protein, as you know. But in developed countries, those are no part of the traditional diets. Consumers are not very familiar with these products, except for sushis. Because of the cultural obstacles, respondents believe that algae will remain mainly an ingredient, but not a real substitute for meat or other animal products. Another substitute candidate, edible insects, follows the same path. The people surveyed are pretty sure that eating insects won't take off in Western countries, in spite of their nutritional value, because of, the yuck factor, the cultural reluctance. But they do think that insects are promising in other parts of the world where they are already eaten, and also that they can be used for animal feed, like fish or poultry. Consumers feel more comfortable with that. And professionals and experts are more convinced by the potential offered by vegetable proteins, and they expect a future made of a mix between different sources of vegetable proteins and mix between vegetable proteins and animal proteins. They are once again divided when it comes to digital nutrition tools, apps and food spectrometers, for example, the phones that can scan your food and reveal their chemical nutrition composition. because they think that on this side of the Atlantic, consumers are not obsessed with nutrition facts. They are not fond of the quantified self. For French consumer, food is above all pleasure. And it works well. It's a famous French paradox. So they foresee this trend spreading only among the person who really have to monitor their health, people with diabetes, for instance. And for the last trend, the wide use of smart cooking tools using sensors, internet connection, and even artificial intelligence like IBM's Chef Watson, they say that they may spread because they allow consumers to cook with fresh products, but without spending more time in the kitchen. However, some of the respondents pointed out that they come with a cost, and even if the cost is going to decline, these tools will remain dedicated to wealthy and connected persons. You won't find a smart fridge in all houses in 2030, according to them. So, in conclusion, you have to pay a lot attention to a lot of factors when you try to foresee the future of food, and not only to the new products launched or about to be launched. So you don't have to forget the consumer acceptance and willingness to pay. The economical factors, is it profitable or not? Don't overestimate the speed of change because the food behaviors are changing quite slowly. Don't miss the real opportunities hidden behind the media hype. And here I think about, for instance, vegetable proteins that are hidden behind the insect hype. So there is a need for this critical analysis and continuous monitoring. And that is what Alimavenir is doing with Vigie Alimentation. It's a group of around 30 organizations, big companies, interprofessional organizations, and also research centers like INRA, National Institute for Agricultural Research. Because this monitoring and this assessment, it requires a collective work. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon for everyone. And first of all, I think so it's a very, very interesting perspective about how big is the food sector. First of all, let me show you, and let me think that I really think that we are not in a food revolution. I think that we are just in a food movement relation about, and we are around the corner of the food revolution. But I am sure that we are not in a food revolution. But let me compare, some very similar sector. Like 3 years ago, started a really, really strong change. And this sector is the automotive sector. Let me show you, for example, this. 3 years ago, it's impossible thinking that one company like Ford invests $1 billion in artificial intelligence. 3 years ago, it is possible thinking about one college kid invests just $700 to have a self-driving car. When I talk about automotive sector, now probably the name is mobility sector, connected cars, etc. It's because we invest the same time cooking and eating like driving cars. 300 hours every year. 300 hours we invest cooking and we invest driving. But if we continue thinking about how the mobility sector have changed, for example, tractor trailers without human is a market of 1.7 million of truck drivers. Imagine it's a self-driving sector. And it's impossible thinking 3 years ago that more than 18,700 startups are focused to reinvent, to rethink the food sector. Or new, for example, was last week, no? The new company of Elon Musk want to solve the traffic with different panels in this one. We are really talking about food sector. We are really talking about automotive sector. Or for example, this relation, one company, Piaggio, automotive sector, that they have this robot. And we had the possibility to put inside some of those groceries and deliver to us. This is automotive sector? It's impossible thinking about those 3 years ago. But we need to think about the future impacts of black swans. How can make condition the future size of food revolution? What is the really size, the really combination? Basically, we are thinking that we are in a new economy, in a new food economy. It's very different from old economy, new economy. A new economy than the previous speaker talking, the consumer of the behavior. They want more convenience, more healthy, more transparency, naturality, personalized, sustainable. The impact of technology in 3 levels. Industry 4.0, manufacturers. In the technology of the consumer, the possibility to have more transparency, no calories, coach nutritional, new business models. The uberization, the shared economy with a combination of food. New perspective of economies, the high impact of protein boom, meal alternatives, superfoods, insect, food substitute. And another, for me, more important, new players that have to be in the center of world. New players like investors players, like for example, Bill Gates, Corda Ventures, Google Ventures, startups. Reimagine Food have a mapping of more than 5,000 food startups from around the world, that they want impact and change the food sector. Or for example, new players like Amazon, Siemens, Alibaba, Fujitsu. This is an important picture that why we are talking about a new food economy. A new food economy with different words, new vocabulary, new rules. We are talking about food replacement, startups, biohackers, vegan startups, nutritionautics, synthetic food, food as a medicine. We don't have these words 5 years ago. And if we start to analyze some figures, some futures. Yes. We have a lot of new figures and new quotes, very simple. For example, 5 billion of US plant-based is industry. It's industry of 5 billion. Or for example, 250% is the change of how Impossible Foods increase his manufacture. Or one important date, in Instagram, you have more than 200 million of food pictures. 200 million on pictures, relation about food. We are so crazy about this. Or for example, we have more than the average Spain for every year, 1,500. Well, the conclusion of this is that we probably have in the next 10 years a new food economy. A new food economy that increase and merge different perspectives. New concepts, like cognitive food, boots of food, molecular food, food for longevity, a smart food city, hybrid eating, neuronal food, some new concepts for new business opportunity, for new challenge in the society that have different integration of the technology. The progress increase of the technology, like that we know, the early adopters, for example, for deep learning, drones, food scanners, collaborative robots, synthetic biology. And what is really the new needs that want the consumer? More healthy, more agility, more personalized, ultra-personalized of food. But we need to think about what is the main quotes that probably change and what is, how big is the sector. Let me show you just six slides, and we need to monitorize what is the real size. For example, one of these. Like I say, we have on one side 200 million of pictures in Instagram, And in the other side, we have technology like deep learning, machine learning, to have the possibility to detect what is really this picture without any tag. To discover, for example, the potential of these 200 million pictures, the new possibility, relation about nutrition, relation about opportunities. This combination, this, John, is probably one of the most important points to decide what is the really choice. If we continue talking about artificial intelligence, for example, some of you probably know Intelligence X is the first beer brewed by artificial intelligence. You have the possibility to personalize your beer after free use for your best flavor. If we continue talking about the combination of different words, for example, if we take the 7 sites, what is the increased keywords that change the percentage of description, of the increase of the mass money? Just one example. Imagine that we merge in science, artificial intelligence, genetic and healthy. What is the conclusion of these words? Probably a new kind of food. And it's probably the basically keywords that for us more money in this size. Obviously, our interaction in the kitchen, at home, how can change, how new products we can, for example, this is Hello X, a virtual assistant, more than Echo, more than Alexa, more the other interaction. What is the really potential of startups or gadgets like this in the new economy? How can increase the perception of the big of? It's the same side when we think it out, two words very different. For example, McDonald's start a partnership with Uber to deliver burgers. We're talking Uber to deliver McDonald's, two potential companies. What other combination we have in this size? No? And very similar, for example, Zomato or Deliveroo now. They start with some specific restaurants that have the more punctuation to start to have a cloud kitchen. Do they have the possibility to expand their business? They don't need another kitchen. They have the same produce dish, and Zomato, or in this case, Deliveroo, have the possibility to increase a 500% its production. We are talking like typical restaurant without borders, with a partner like Zomato or Deliveroo to expand his knowledge, his restaurant, his soul more than them. And obviously in Caesar chips, we have we are talking about in London underground the urban farming, the vertical farming, analyze the different places of cities. When we talk about a smart food city, we need to increase the different perspective of life mice or how in the city we can produce approximately between 30 and 40% of all die. Or the combination of, with artificial intelligence, the bots. Now is the era of bots. Imagine the bots to Pixar. In this case, this company is Facebook. Facebook starts some business relation food market. But if we need to think about, or we need to learn about some important points, is we need that the technology increase the experience. We need that the technology increase the flavor. In this boom of startups, in this boom of food tech, probably 3 weeks ago, we have the case of Juicero, one startup that have a rising more than $120 million, and it's not necessary the gadget of this machine. And now we need the perspective of the next 5 years to discover if the technology really improve our experience. Is the technology really have the possibility that we discover calories, pesticides from every product? Maybe. I'm sure that, but we probably need need 10 years more. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
So, thank you for being here tonight. Before you are ready for your aperitivo and, an evening in town, I would like to recap a bit of what I've heard so far today. We've learned about how the American average family would still cook their food in the 50s, in the 60s. I remember I was a foreign exchange student in 1971. In the Midwest, and Mom would cook every night, and people were thin and were fit. I've been going back and forth to the States for the past 47 years, and it's not the same enjoyable place. I'm Italian, I enjoy food, and I am thankful that I live in a country where food is still very much appreciated, and where you can still source quality food, and you can buy quality food everywhere. I was in France last week, it's the same. So we live in a fortunate part of the world here. But problems are everywhere. There are problems of fraud, there are problems of trusting who you are buying your food from. There are problems in trusting who you're dealing in business terms with in order to do the exchange of services and purchase of produce you need to transform into viable food. If you are a consumer, you want to be sure that what you buy is organic milk and not just named organic milk. How do you do that? That's why, as PwC, we have started some time ago a global program we dubbed today Food Trust. In the beginning, it was named Food Safety. It had to do with security. It had to do with anti-fraud. Now we have shifted a bit, moved away from that sort of negative perspective into something which believe is much more appealing, and not only in business terms, but also in terms of actual credible growth of the business, because in the end of the day, you have to balance aspirations, the ideals, the expectations, and the business. If there is no business, there is no investment. If there is no investment, the virtuous circle cannot be started and kept going. So, what I would like to draw your attention on today, very briefly, in this 15 minutes or so, is what we call Food Trust, the ideas behind that, and the technology, which is pretty amazing, state-of-the-art, advanced technologies. You've heard in the previous session and in these sessions, some of the speakers already named some of the technologies and techniques we are adopting here. I will come back to that, but this is not a technology speech. This is a business vision, business strategy speech in terms of food industry. So, if you come to Italy, we've heard very much about the US, enough about the US, about food, that's not the best practice in the world, definitely not. If you come to Italy as an example, and France is just about the same, just to build on what a previous speaker did, if you stick to consider the value of food on average, you see the numbers here. There is a remarkable share of the population that is ready and willing to pay more to have better food for products which are safe and of good quality, for products which are credible because they are 0 kilometers, so they are produced nearby, they do not come from far away, which implies long supply chains in terms of refrigeration, for instance, an environmental impact in terms of transportation. If you source fresh pineapples from Central America and you buy them here the day after, of course, the environmental impact is huge. And, okay, the pineapple is great, but the environmental impact is not sustainable on the long term. And therefore, the idea of sourcing quality food nearby is gaining momentum and gaining pace, and should be considered with a sort of blue quality seal that is demonstrable and is demonstrated that food, if it claims to be local, it is in fact local, which is not always the case. And I come back to that. And if you stick to that sort of, look at the marketplace and you focus on the millennials, that segment of consumers, you will see that this is even more true. Millennials are very much caring about food quality, about the healthy food, and about the satisfactory, if you want, the satisfactory experience in enjoying food, as simple as that. That might be cultural. As my French colleague said before, this might be really cultural. We enjoy food like you do in France, of course, but that also has to do with health, with your being fit, of course, feeling well. Clearly, this does come to a cost. So the problem is how you can widen the cross-section of providing good quality food to people that are not awfully rich only, to more, to larger segments of the population. But clearly, there is a sort of a cultural shift happening here. The generation, the baby boomers, who were happy with more industrialized solutions in terms of feeding themselves, probably, they are giving now space to this new wave of people. It is very much a European, I would say, experience to say that depends on your family. You were brought up in a family that did do cooking at home or not, independent of whether mother was working or not, outside, and a family where you do cook every day, even simple things, but healthy things, is different from buying ready-made food or processed food, industrial food from outside. So all this has to do also with, this is an Italian example, with the press. In this example, you have fraud on the left of the slide, you have doubts, questions asked in the middle, and you have awards, praise, rewards for top quality on the right side. And this has not to do or to deal with the large size or the small size of the company. You can be a large company and be very virtuous, or you can be a small producer and be a hasty fraudster. Okay, so you can't say, I do not trust the large industrial compounds because they are not honest, and I do trust the small producers because it might be really the other case around, that you find a small producer that is not really sticking to the quality and the respect of the protocols as they should. Now, when it comes to food, the question here is, do I trust this food? And you do not trust someone or something unless you do know that someone or that something. That has to do with identity. If you know that that piece of bread is made with organic wheat coming from an organic culture, from a non-polluted field, a non-polluted air, environmental blob around that field, if it might happen. Well, if you know that this is the case and you can demonstrate that, then you can say that that piece of bread made in that way is good and organic. And being good and organic from a point of view of quality has nothing to do with being appreciable from a tasteful and appealing and satisfactory situation of a connoisseur of good food. Those are two different things here, okay? Healthy is not necessarily good in terms of pleasant. Like in the internet, on the net, you cannot really tell a dog by, simply knowing or asking who's on the other side. You have to prove your identity. So we have tried traditionally to prove identity of the food with certification. Certification methods, techniques, processes, authorities, you name it. There's plenty of them. Now, we have seen many situations where these certificates simply do not work. They are sort of red tape statements. You need to have that. But the point is that the information that is exchanged within the supply chain is so fragmented and so limited by sort of Chinese walls, does not flow outside one entity onto the next entity in a way that is transparent and giving the right explanation and documentation of what is transmitted from producer to a client, from a purveyor to the next one in the chain. So the point is, in a physical world, you can easily forge paper, or you can easily bypass sampling tests or occasional checks. In a digital world, you might think of a system that continuously monitors and learn what you're doing, what you're talking about, what you're producing, what you're exchanging, and so on. But you need to certify who's doing what. So how you can combine the two worlds in a way that is innovative, unique, and I would say revolutionary? Well, there is no silver bullet here. One way, we believe, is to build on a word that I've heard twice today, and I was very pleased: transparency. Being transparent does not necessarily mean you're giving away your industrial confidential information. Being transparent means that if you are collaborating, and this is another word that I've heard twice in this afternoon, and this is a very important word, collaboration. If you're collaborating in a transparent way, you can exchange that information that is suitable for the full process to happen, that is the food to transform from a produce, say, fodder into something else, say, milk. In the middle, you need a cow. That is the factory of the milk, okay? How do you know whether the cow is healthy, whether the cow was fed on antibiotics to make it, to protect it, or hormones to make it more suitable to the production faster? You need to prove that, you need to detect that, and the methods of doing that is either rely on the goodwill of someone who tells you, I did it, I'm, compliant, this is the manifesto of my goodwill, and this is the chapter, the discipline I impose to myself or some authority imposed to me. Or you can prove that by letting the data that prove your production and the way you manage your product and your processes flow to the next partners in your ecosystem. So transparency implies collaboration, and the two together, if they are put at work, they give you better visibility and extended visibility on the entire ecosystem of producers. Now, a shift from the traditional situation, which you see depicted here on the left, to the next future situation, which you see on the right, is dramatic, because you move from a traditional tailor-like supply chain, where you move something from A to B to C and so on, up to the end to the consumer. You shift from a connected, a vision of a connected ecosystem, which is very much in harmony with today's view of the digital economy. You shift from a traceability is seen as being able to prove that this thing came from there and arrived here, to something that tells you also what is that thing, intimately, you know. It's not good enough to say that that milk was sourced in Poland. You want to know everything about the cows that were milked and so on. That's not much to do with the origin of a good. It has to do with the whole history of that good. So you need to collect that history and go beyond the product specifications and labeling into something which tells you what is the actual identity of that thing. And the identity is basically something which is the end result of the data collected throughout the life cycle of a product. So from the fodder to the cow, to the milk, to the cheese, you need to know that that piece of cheese you have on your dish right now, you know, it's on the table, on your fork, comes from that fodder that was actually, or was not, by the way, who cares? Or if you care, you do buy something else, whether it was organic or not. That field that produced that fodder, that cow, and so on. Now, all this sounds very, very complex and very, I would say, well, puts you off, okay? It's very, very complicated. It can be done. It was done. It is being done around the industry. And it is done because also it has benefits on the everyday business. It hits and impacts all the efficiency and efficacy of the, you know, of your business doing. In your company, you hit procurement, you can buy better, you manage better your raw materials, you collaborate with your ecosystem partners, you have total quality, which is pervasive, and so on. Now, how do you do that in real terms? Let me do an example. We have signed an agreement as PwC with an Italian startup. They are based in Naples. It's Penelope, who's the sponsor, the official sponsor of this session today. And they have built over the years this platform, which is called ValueGo. ValueGo is basically an information technology environment that is based on an Internet of Things paradigm and uses something which the technology guys call ontologies. Wow. You know, to depict food and the rules that pertain to food. The point is, and I'll make it simple, that the software knows what wine is, what milk is, what cheese is. Cheese, milk, and wine in their nature and essence. So they do not treat milk as just any product. They know that milk has to come from a biological process which happens within something which is called a cow. They know that cheese comes from milk and that milk has to be kept at a given standard temperature, should not raise above a certain level, otherwise the milk might go sour. All these rules that describe how the product is represented and how it is treated, how it develops over time, they're called ontologies. They are basically data models and rules and controls and checkpoints that allow you in a semi or fully automated way, if you connect data from sensors which are spread all over your ecosystems, to connect all the dots and decide that that shipment of milk, say 50 liters coming from that small farmer to your milk center, well, they cannot be accepted because the van had a problem. He stayed, he spent 3 hours on the road and the fridge was broken. You cannot accept that. Otherwise, if you do accept that, the system will automatically trigger an alert. And triggering an alert, you know that something was wrong in the production of that cheese. that cheese cannot cope with a standard definition and with the rules that were set by an authority or a customer or whatever. And this can be collected as the product transitions in many metamorphoses from fodder, I would say from a seed into a plant, into fodder. The cow eats the fodder and transforms into milk and so on, and up to the piece of cheese you find at the supermarket. And with a simple, very simple device like a smartphone, you can scan a QR code on the cheese and know all the history. This was done 2 years ago here in Italy for the first time in the world by Barilla. Barilla, there was the expo that had to do with food, and thanks to Penelope and the Value Go platform, they were able to implement for the first time globally this concept for pasta production and tomato and basil soup. So the pasta and the tomato sauce were both represented throughout their history. All the data were collected since the tomato were seeds. In fact, the data about the field, the soil was polluted or not polluted. In fact, it was bio. It was organic, and the pollution was kept under control on daily basis by sensors which were inserted in the soil, and so on, the quality of the air, or quality of the water. You can tell a story about a footprint in terms of sustainability of the carbon dioxide or the water footprint that you had to consider in producing that box of pasta. And most important, when you buy a box of pasta, you know the story of that box, not of the whole production on average. That very product you have in your hands. So this is the real dramatic revolution that we are after. Let the consumer know what is literally in their hands at any moment, and let them decide by simply knowing the story whether they are happy or not with that specific product, which again allows you to differentiate and have high top quality, absolutely organic product, which is about sort of oxymoron. Being totally organic is absolutely impossible if you are an industrial compound. It's impossible because whether you use fertilizers or not, your soil will be hit by some other conditions, transportations, others. So unless you can prove your whole supply chain has been totally 100% organically compliant, there is no way you can state you are an organic producer. And that is unfortunately one of the big problems we see today in the industry. Many companies claiming they produce organically, and in fact they don't. They don't because they simply stop their definition at a certain point of the supply chain, and they do not consider what's beyond that, before that. So really, if you want to know, and if you want to tell and convince, you have to disclose. And this is what I call visibility, transparency. The whole history from field to fork about your product. Unless you use digital technologies, you can't do that. It's either too expensive or altogether impossible. By using this sort of technologies and a cooperative approach from part of the different business partners in the ecosystems, which is not an easy thing to do, believe me, you can change that situation. A large company like Barilla, for instance, which was my example, can do that. Walmart is trying to do that now in their supply chain. We just signed a deal with Alibaba to do this sort of pilot test in New Zealand and Australia with what regards dairy products. I was not talking about dairy products by chance so far, okay? This is a very complex and very delicate supply chain, because the material is delicate in itself, and it's easily forged. and you don't know very much about the cows, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it's very complex. Apparently it's easy, but it's very complex. And probiotics from Australia. So those are two very interesting domains of, well, investigations we are now considering. We are talking here in Italy to some of the largest food manufacturers on the marketplace. It's easier to start with a big company that can have some negotiation power with their ecosystems, so they can propose or altogether impose their point of view on smaller producers, okay? I see that in one situation where you have consortia and you have peers, basically, and a club of peers, which want to keep very high quality, and they don't want to disclose anything which is beyond the needed, okay? So there is a lot of things you can consider, and this is what we call the Food Trust Program. Reinstate trust in what you buy, what you eat, what you trade. Thank you.